Inside the glass tower of Harrison and Wells, Brian stood in a conference room where every eye held contempt. Worn blazer, scuffed shoes, single dad with no degree. "You're wasting our time," someone said. His hand touched the door handle to leave. Then the notification hit every screen. Project Horizon collapsed. $20 million gone. A data error their entire team couldn't solve in 18 months. Brian glanced at the projection screen through the open door. His brain caught something in 5 seconds. "I know where the error is," he said quietly. "Can this invisible man turn around his destiny? And the company's?" 3 months earlier, Brian had been stacking boxes in a warehouse at 2 a.m. when he saw the job posting. Data engineer position, Harrison and Wells, one of the top consulting firms in the city. He stared at the screen for a long time before hitting apply. The morning of the interview, he borrowed $60 from his neighbor to buy a blazer from the thrift store on 7th Street. It smelled like mothballs and the elbows were thin. He spent 20 minutes polishing his only pair of dress shoes until they looked almost acceptable. His daughter Emma sat at the kitchen table eating cereal. 5 years old. She didn't ask why Daddy was wearing fancy clothes. She'd learned not to ask too many questions about money. "Be good for Mrs. Patterson today," Brian said, kissing the top of her head. The Harrison and Wells building was all glass and steel. 40 stories of people who belonged there. The receptionist looked him up and down when he gave his name. Her eyes lingered on his worn clothes, the way he stood. "4th floor," she said without smiling. The conference room was cold. 4 people sat behind a long table with bottles of imported water and leather portfolios. Victoria Hayes, the CEO, sat in the middle. Dark eyes that gave nothing away. She'd built this company from nothing 15 years ago. To her left sat Marcus Chen, head of data engineering, MIT graduate, kind face, thoughtful demeanor. To her right was Sarah Kim, senior HR director, Yale MBA, professional efficiency. And at the end sat Jonathan Price, senior data scientist, Stanford PhD, published researcher. 6 years with the company. 34 years old, impeccably dressed, with the kind of confidence that came from never being told no. He was also the lead architect on Project Horizon, the company's flagship contract. Jonathan studied Brian's resume, his expression flickering between amusement and contempt. "So, Brian," Victoria said, "tell us about your educational background." Brian's throat went dry. "I attended State University for 3 years. I didn't complete my degree." Jonathan leaned forward. "You didn't finish college? May I ask why?" "My wife got sick. I had to drop out to take care of her." "I'm sorry to hear that." His tone was warm. "And now?" "She passed away 3 years ago." "That must have been difficult." Jonathan paused. "But help me understand something. You're applying for a senior data engineering position at one of the most competitive firms in the industry. No degree. No professional experience. What makes you think you're qualified?" Brian had prepared for this. "I've been teaching myself data engineering for 5 years, every night after work. I've built projects, learned Python and SQL, studied machine learning algorithms. I passed your online assessment test with a 96% score." Jonathan's expression warmed slightly. "A 96%. Impressive for a screening test. Though that test is designed to filter out completely unqualified candidates, not identify top talent." He glanced at his notes. "I see you work 3 jobs currently. Warehouse loading, delivery driving, weekend retail?" "Yes, sir." "Admirable work ethic. But those are jobs requiring physical labor, not analytical thinking. Data engineering at our level requires rigorous training and peer collaboration from a top-tier academic program. It's about learning to think systematically, to approach problems with proven methodologies." The question landed like a velvet-wrapped knife, polite enough that no one could call it hostile, sharp enough to cut. Brian pulled out his laptop. "I've built a portfolio. I can show you what I've worked on." "Please do." Brian opened his projects. Customer segmentation analysis, predictive maintenance model, recommendation engine coded from scratch. Jonathan studied them carefully, his interest seemingly genuine. These are good, really. For self-taught work, this is better than I expected. But can I point out a few things? He projected Brian's code on screen. This segmentation analysis you're using k-means clustering, which is fine for basics. But you haven't accounted for the curse of dimensionality. With this many features, your clusters are likely meaningless noise. Formal statistics training would have taught you dimensionality reduction. First, PCA, T-SNE, something proper. He clicked to another project. And this predictive maintenance model. You're using random forest without tuning hyperparameters beyond defaults. Your cross-validation is problematic. K-fold on time series data creates data leakage. The model is essentially cheating. This would never pass peer review. Jonathan's voice remained kind, almost teacherly. These are exactly the mistakes someone makes learning alone without proper mentorship. No judgment, I'm impressed you got this far. But it illustrates why formal education matters. It's not gatekeeping. It's ensuring quality in high-stakes environments. Brian's face burned. Every word was technically correct. The criticisms were valid. Impossible to defend against. Marcus spoke up. Jonathan makes fair points about technical details. But I'm curious about your thought process, Brian. Walk me through how you approached the maintenance model. Brian explained his reasoning. The problem formulation, the pre-processing, the algorithm choice. It wasn't perfect, but it was thoughtful. Marcus nodded. The approach is sound, even if implementation has issues. That's something we can work with. In an entry-level position, absolutely, Jonathan agreed. But Brian's applying for a senior role. We need people who can lead projects, mentor junior staff, interface with clients who have PhDs. I'm not sure this is the right fit. Victoria had been silent throughout, observing. Now she spoke. What's your assessment of the Horizon project, Brian? From what you've seen publicly, Brian hesitated. He'd researched extensively. Project Horizon was their biggest success, a customer retention platform promising 91% accuracy. I think it's impressive work. The accuracy numbers are strong. Jonathan nodded appreciatively. Thank you. I led the development. 18 months of work with 8 PhD-level data scientists. It's currently the gold standard for retention analytics. Though I did wonder, Brian added quietly, about the baseline assumptions in the active user definition. From your methodology paper, it looks like engagement is measured primarily through login frequency. Something shifted in Jonathan's eyes. That's correct. Industry standard. Right. I just thought. Login frequency doesn't always correlate with actual engagement. Someone could log in daily because of automated reminders, but never really use the product. We account for that through secondary metrics, Jonathan replied smoothly. Session duration, feature interaction depth, transaction completion. It's all in the technical documentation. I'm sure it is, Brian said. He didn't push further. Victoria stood. Thank you for coming in, Brian. We'll be in touch. Handshakes all around. Marcus gave him an encouraging nod. Sarah was professionally neutral. Jonathan walked him to the door. Best of luck with your job search. Really. And if you're interested in formal education, I could recommend some good online master's programs. Thank you. Jonathan paused. You know, I understand the hunger to prove yourself. The difference is, I did it the right way. Through the system. Because the system exists for a reason. His expression remained kind. Sometimes the best thing we can do is recognize our limitations. Not everyone is meant for this level of work, and that's okay. Brian left the building with those words echoing in his head. 2 days later, the rejection email arrived. We've decided to move forward with other candidates whose qualifications more closely align with our needs. Brian deleted it and went back to his warehouse job. 3 months passed. Brian had almost forgotten about Harrison and Wells when his phone rang. Unknown number. Mr. Miller? This is Victoria Hayes from Harrison and Wells. Brian's heart stopped. Miss Hayes, hello. I know this is unexpected, but we have an opening. One of our data engineers accepted a position elsewhere. I remembered your interview. I'd like you to come in tomorrow. Yes. Of course. Thank you. 9 in the morning. Same building. The next morning, Brian wore the same worn blazer. Victoria met him in the lobby personally. Thank you for coming on short notice. Let me show you to your workspace. Workspace. The position is yours if you want it. Junior data engineer. 65,000 annually. Not senior level, but it's a foot in the door. Brian's head spun. Yes. Absolutely. Thank you. Victoria led him upstairs to an open floor plan filled with engineers at sleek desks. She pointed to a small desk near the window. You'll sit here. Marcus Chen will be your direct supervisor. You'll support ongoing projects, learn our systems, prove yourself here, and there's room to grow. She handed him a folder. Employment paperwork. It will get you credentials. Welcome to Harrison and Wells. Brian took the folder with shaking hands. I won't let you down. I know you won't. Victoria paused. One thing. Jonathan Price leads our major projects. You'll work closely with him. He has high standards, but if you're willing to learn, you'll grow. I understand. An hour later, Jonathan appeared at his desk. Same polished appearance. Brian, welcome to the team. He extended his hand. Thank you. I'm excited to be here. Victoria mentioned she hired you. I'll admit, I was surprised we usually require degrees even for junior positions. But she's the boss, and she clearly sees something in you. I'm happy to give you a shot. I appreciate that. I'm leading a project that could use support work. Data cleaning, basic validation, nothing too complex to start. Good way to learn our systems. Jonathan pulled up a chair. The project is Horizon. You remember it from your interview. The retention analysis platform. Exactly. We're expanding it for a major retail client. $20 million contract. He nodded encouragingly. I'll have Marcus assign you to my team. You'll report to me directly on this one. Sounds great. Perfect. Oh, and Brian? Jonathan's voice dropped, became confidential. I don't hold the interview against you. That criticism of your portfolio, that was me doing my job, being thorough. But now that you're here, I'm rooting for you. Really. Thank you, Jonathan. We're colleagues now. Teammates. I've got your back. He clapped Brian on the shoulder. Welcome aboard. Over the next 3 months, Brian threw himself into the work. He arrived early, stayed late, learned databases, coding standards, project management systems, and he worked on Horizon. Jonathan assigned him tasks daily. Data cleaning, validation checks, documentation updates. Grunt work, but necessary. Brian did it without complaint. Jonathan was always friendly, always encouraging. He'd stop by Brian's desk to offer guidance, share insights. Other team members respected him enormously. Brilliant, approachable, always willing to mentor. But Brian started noticing patterns. When he'd find a potential issue in the data and bring it to Jonathan, the concern would be acknowledged graciously. Then nothing would happen. Good catch. Let me look into that. Weeks later, the issue remained. When he'd suggest an improvement to the model architecture, Jonathan would listen thoughtfully, ask probing questions, then explain always reasonably why that approach wouldn't work in their context. When he completed tasks ahead of schedule, Jonathan would praise his efficiency and add 3 more tasks. The pile never shrank. Brian told himself he was being paranoid. Jonathan was his mentor, his advocate. Then came the team meeting in month 2. Jonathan was presenting Horizon progress to senior leadership. Brian sat in the back with other junior engineers. Our retention model is performing beautifully, Jonathan announced, advancing through slides. 91% accuracy across all customer segments. The client is thrilled with preliminary results. He clicked to a slide showing model architecture. Brian leaned forward. Something looked familiar. We've implemented several innovative features. Device-level tracking capabilities, enhanced engagement scoring, predictive churn flags. These improvements came from deep collaboration across our team. Brian's stomach went cold. 3 weeks ago, he'd written a memo to Jonathan suggesting device fingerprinting to catch duplicate accounts. Jonathan had thanked him. said it was worth exploring eventually, but not a priority for the current timeline. Now it was in the presentation, listed as an implemented feature, presented as Jonathan's innovation. 2 months ago, Brian had proposed engagement scoring based on product usage rather than just login frequency. Jonathan had explained why that wouldn't work with their data structure. Now it was in the model, no mention of where the idea originated. After the meeting, Brian approached Jonathan carefully. The device fingerprinting feature that's similar to what I suggested in my memo, right? Jonathan looked genuinely puzzled. Oh, the memo. Right, I remember now. You might have planted a seed there. Good thinking. Shows you're starting to grasp how we approach these problems. His expression warmed. That's the beauty of collaborative work. Ideas come from everywhere, get refined through discussion, become something greater than any individual contribution. You're part of that process now. Brian nodded slowly. Right. Collaborative. Exactly. Keep bringing those suggestions. Even if we can't use everything, it's good practice. Helps you develop analytical thinking. Brian went back to his desk. He pulled up the project repository and checked the commit history for the device fingerprinting feature. Author: Jonathan Price. No mention of Brian's memo. No reference at all. He checked the engagement scoring feature. Same thing. Brian stared at his screen. He could raise this issue. Go to Marcus or Victoria. But what would he say? That he'd suggested ideas in informal memos and now those ideas were in the codebase? In a collaborative environment, wasn't that how things worked? He had no proof the ideas were his. No documentation beyond emails Jonathan could easily characterize as junior engineer asking questions. And Jonathan had a PhD from Stanford and 6 years at the company. Brian was a junior engineer with no degree who'd been there for 2 months. Who would they believe? Brian said nothing. Instead, he started keeping detailed notes. At work, he documented assigned tasks. At home, he wrote his real ideas, observations about the Horizon project, things that didn't add up. He kept a summary copy in his desk drawer. By month 3, the pattern was clear. Jonathan took Brian's ideas, refined them, presented them as his own, always with plausible deniability. You're really developing as an engineer, Jonathan would say. I can see the influence of working on a high-level project. You're learning to think like we do. The other team members never saw it. Jonathan was too careful. He'd never take an idea Brian had shared publicly. Only suggestions made privately, in one-on-one conversations or individual emails. And Jonathan was generous in other ways. He'd praise Brian's work to Marcus, include him in team lunches, offer career advice. He played the role perfectly, but Brian's best ideas kept appearing in Jonathan's work, and Brian kept getting assigned to data cleaning while Jonathan presented breakthrough innovations to leadership. 3 months in, Brian was exhausted. Not from the work, from the constant calculation. Which ideas were safe to share? How could he contribute without feeding someone who was using him? He stopped making suggestions to Jonathan directly, and he waited. Then came the morning when everything broke. Brian arrived at the office to find chaos. People rushing between conference rooms, phones ringing constantly. The calm atmosphere of Harrison and Wells shattered into panic. He caught Marcus in the hallway. What's happening? Marcus's face was drawn. Horizon collapsed. The client pulled the contract. $20 million gone. What? Why? They said our retention model is fundamentally flawed. They hired an external auditor who found critical errors in our methodology. They're taking their business to Stratton Analytics and threatening to sue for misrepresentation. Brian's mouth went dry. What kind of errors? I don't know yet. Victoria called an emergency meeting. Everyone on the Horizon team needs to be there. That includes you. They walked to the main conference room together. The room was packed. Senior leadership lined one wall. The Horizon team filled the seats. Jonathan stood near the front, face pale but composed. Victoria stood at the head of the table. Her expression was carved from ice. For those who haven't heard, our client terminated the Horizon contract this morning. They've provided a detailed technical audit showing that our 91% retention accuracy is actually closer to 68% when properly calculated. The discrepancy stems from fundamental errors in how we defined active users and filtered duplicate accounts. She let that sink in. The room was dead silent. This is the biggest failure in this company's history. $20 million. Our reputation, client relationships, everything is now in question. Her eyes swept across the team. I need to understand how this happened. Jonathan, you're the technical lead. Explain. Jonathan stood smoothly. Even in crisis, he maintained composure. Victoria, I'm as shocked as everyone else. We followed standard methodology throughout development. Multiple rounds of peer review, validation testing. Everything indicated the model was sound. Then how did we miss a 23-point accuracy gap? I don't have a complete answer yet. But the error isn't in the core algorithm. It's in data pre-processing. Specifically, how we filtered duplicate accounts and defined engagement metrics. He pulled up a slide showing model architecture. We used email-based deduplication, which is industry standard. We measured engagement through login frequency and session metrics, also standard practice. Victoria's voice was sharp. If it's all standard practice, why did the auditor find it insufficient? Because they're applying different standards than we learned in academic training. I built this model using the same methodologies I published papers on, the same approaches taught at top institutions. If there's a flaw, it's systemic to the entire field, not unique to our implementation. He sounded reasonable, rational, like someone grappling honestly with unexpected failure. But Brian saw something else. The slight shift in posture, the way his fingers drummed against his laptop, the calculated pause before each answer. Jonathan was covering, and Brian knew why. 3 months ago, Brian had suggested device fingerprinting to catch duplicate accounts. Jonathan had dismissed it as not a priority, but in the month 2 presentation, Jonathan had claimed it was already implemented. He'd lied to leadership about having that feature, stolen Brian's idea in name only, never actually building it, just using it to make his presentation look more impressive. 2 months ago, Brian had questioned whether login frequency was a good proxy for actual engagement. Jonathan had explained why the current approach was sound. 1 month ago, Brian had written a detailed memo outlining potential biases in the active user definition. Jonathan had thanked him and said they'd revisit it in the next iteration. All of those suggestions would have caught the errors. All of them. Jonathan had ignored every single one because implementing them would mean admitting that someone without credentials had spotted flaws in his work, and now those ignored warnings had cost the company $20 million. Brian sat in his chair, hands clenched. He could speak up right now. Tell Victoria about the memos. About the suggestions Jonathan had dismissed, but he had no proof that would hold up. His memos were informal, phrased as questions rather than definitive recommendations. Jonathan could easily reframe them as a junior engineer asking for clarification on concepts he didn't fully understand. It would be Brian's word against Jonathan's. The new guy with no formal education versus the brilliant PhD who'd built the company's flagship project. Victoria would never believe him. Brian stayed silent. The meeting continued. People threw out theories, suggestions, damage control strategies. Jonathan positioned himself as the level-headed expert trying to diagnose an unprecedented failure. We need to identify the root cause before we do anything, Jonathan stated, his voice carrying authority. I'll lead a forensic analysis of the data pipeline. Give me 48 hours to pinpoint exactly where the methodology broke down. Victoria considered this. 48 hours. Then I want a full report and remediation plan. You'll have it. The meeting broke up. Brian stood slowly, his mind churning. Jonathan caught him at the door. Same expression, though strained by stress. Tough day. Yeah. I'm going to need all hands on deck for this analysis. Can you pull the raw data logs from the past 6 months? Everything from the user registration pipeline. Brian nodded. Sure. Thanks. I know this is stressful, but we'll figure it out. That's what teams do. Jonathan squeezed his shoulder and walked away. Brian went back to his desk. He pulled up the data logs Jonathan requested, stared at them without really seeing. His phone buzzed. A text from Emma's school. Parent-teacher conference request. He texted back, "I'll be there." Then he opened his desk drawer and pulled out his summary notebook, the one where he'd been documenting observations about Horizon for 3 months. The detailed version was at home, but this copy had the key points. Every suggestion Jonathan had dismissed. Every warning flag Jonathan had ignored. Every shortcut taken in the name of meeting deadlines. It was all there, detailed, time-stamped, including dates of his memos to Jonathan. Brian had been collecting evidence without fully realizing it. Protecting himself, maybe. Or just trying to make sense of why his ideas kept disappearing into Jonathan's project without acknowledgement. Now that evidence told a clear story. Jonathan had known about these problems for months, and had chosen to ignore them rather than admit someone he considered beneath him had spotted flaws in his work. Brian could go to Victoria right now, show her the notebook, prove that the Horizon failure wasn't just bad luck or honest mistake, it was negligence born from pride and ego. But what would happen then? Jonathan would be fired, probably. A $20 million failure with documented warnings he'd ignored. Even his credentials wouldn't save him. And Brian? He might be vindicated, praised for trying to prevent the disaster. Or he might be seen as the guy who threw his mentor under the bus. The junior engineer who hoarded information instead of escalating it. The troublemaker who'd been there 3 months and was already causing problems. He'd probably lose his job either way. This kind of political explosion didn't leave bystanders unscathed. Brian closed his notebook. He couldn't afford to lose this job. Emma depended on him. $65,000 a year was more than he'd ever made. It was health insurance and stable rent and the zoo on weekends. He couldn't throw that away to take down Jonathan, even if Jonathan deserved it. Brian opened the data logs again and started compiling the files Jonathan had requested. He'd keep his head down, do his job, survive. The conference room door burst open. 3 senior executives rushed out, faces drained of color. One was shouting into a phone. The board is furious. They want answers today, not in 48 hours. Brian looked up from his desk. Through the conference room's glass walls, he could see Victoria standing with arms crossed, listening to someone on speakerphone. Then Jonathan appeared in the hallway, walking quickly toward the conference room. He saw Brian and paused. "Did you finish pulling those data logs?" "Almost. Another 20 minutes. Send them the moment they're ready." Victoria's under massive pressure from the board. "We need to show progress." Jonathan's voice was tight. The polished facade had cracked under stress. He walked into the conference room. Through the glass, Brian watched him join the conversation with Victoria and the senior team. Then the arguing started. Brian couldn't hear the words, but he could see the body language. Gestures getting sharper, voices rising. Jonathan defending himself while Victoria listened with that frozen expression. A junior engineer walked past Brian's desk, carrying a box of belongings. Her eyes were red. "What happened to Jenny?" Brian asked Marcus, who was passing by. Marcus's expression was grim. "Budget cuts. Victoria's making moves already. If we can't fix Horizon, there'll be more layoffs. Maybe a lot more." He walked away. Brian sat there, feeling sick. People were losing their jobs. The company was in free fall. And he had information that could help, locked in a notebook he was too afraid to share. Through the glass wall, he saw Jonathan pointing at the projection screen, making his case. Still the brilliant expert. Still covering his tracks while other people paid the price. Brian thought about Emma, about stability and health insurance and keeping his head down. Then he thought about Jenny carrying her box of belongings, about the other engineers who might lose their jobs because Jonathan was too proud to admit he'd ignored warnings. He opened his desk drawer and pulled out his notebook. His hand was shaking as he stood up. He walked toward the conference room. Every step felt like walking underwater. Heavy. Wrong. He could turn around right now, go back to his desk, send the data logs, keep his job. But Jenny was already gone. More people would follow. The company was dying because of lies and ego and hoarded information. Brian knocked on the conference room door. Nobody heard him over the arguing. He knocked louder. Victoria turned. Her expression shifted from ice to irritation. "What?" "I know why Horizon failed," Brian said. His voice came out steadier than his hands. "And I can prove it." The room went dead silent. Jonathan's face went pale, then red. "Brian, this isn't the time. I have documentation," Brian continued, looking at Victoria. 3 months of memos and suggestions about problems in the Horizon model. Problems that would have prevented this failure if they'd been addressed. Victoria's eyes narrowed. "What kind of documentation?" Brian opened his notebook. "Device fingerprinting to catch duplicate accounts. I suggested it 3 months ago. Jonathan said it wasn't a priority." He showed her the dated entry. Then, in the month 2 leadership presentation, he claimed it was already implemented. But it wasn't. He lied about having that feature. Enhanced engagement scoring based on product usage instead of just login frequency. "I raised concerns 2 months ago." Jonathan explained why the current approach was sufficient. Another page. Biases in the active user definition that would inflate retention numbers. "I wrote a detailed memo 1 month ago. Jonathan said we'd revisit it in the next iteration." He looked at Jonathan. "Every single issue the auditor found, I flagged. You dismissed all of them. And then you lied to leadership about implementing at least one of them." Jonathan's composed facade cracked. Those were questions from a junior engineer trying to understand our methodology. I was mentoring you through the learning process. You're mischaracterizing." "I have the emails," Brian replied quietly. "Timestamped. With your responses. Including the one where I explicitly warned that our duplicate account filtering would artificially inflate our user base." Victoria held out her hand. "Let me see that notebook." Brian handed it over. She flipped through pages. Read his entries. Cross-referenced dates. The room was absolutely silent. When Victoria looked up, her expression had changed. No longer ice. Something hotter. More dangerous. "Jonathan, you received these warnings?" "They weren't warnings. They were yes or no." Jonathan's jaw clenched. "I received memos from Brian raising various questions about the methodology." "Yes, but in context, did you implement any of his suggestions?" "Some were incorporated into later iterations." "Before or after the client audit?" Silence. "Before or after, Jonathan?" "After," he admitted quietly. Victoria closed the notebook, set it on the table with deliberate care. "You ignored warnings from your team member. Warnings that, if addressed, would have prevented a $20 million failure. And when that failure happened, you positioned yourself as the expert investigating what went wrong, rather than admitting you'd been told what was wrong months ago." "I'm the technical lead," Jonathan countered, his voice edged. "I've published papers on this exact subject. Brian has no formal education, no professional experience. I used my judgment to evaluate his suggestions against established methodological standards. Your judgment cost this company $20 million and God knows how many jobs." Victoria's voice was sharp enough to cut glass. "Your credentials don't give you the right to ignore valid technical concerns because they came from someone you don't consider your peer." She turned to Brian. "Why didn't you escalate this?" Brian met her eyes. "Because I'm a junior engineer with no degree who's been here 3 months. Who would have believed me over him?" The truth of that statement hung in the air. Victoria was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "You should have escalated anyway. To Marcus, to me, to someone. Hoarding this information while the project failed doesn't make you a hero. It makes you complicit." The words hit like a physical blow. Brian nodded slowly. "You're right. I was afraid of losing my job. I was wrong." "Yes, you were." Victoria's expression softened slightly. "But at least you're admitting it now, which is more than I can say for some people." She looked at Jonathan. "You're off the Horizon project effective immediately. Administrative leave pending full review of your conduct. Marcus will take over as technical lead." Jonathan's face went white. "Victoria, you can't." "I can. And I am. Clear your desk. Jonathan stood there for a moment, his carefully constructed image crumbling. Then he turned and walked out without another word. The door closed behind him. The remaining executives shifted uncomfortably. Victoria turned to Brian. You have all the documentation on what should have been fixed? Yes, ma'am. Good. You're now assigned to work directly with Marcus on the Horizon remediation. Full time. We need your technical insights to rebuild this model properly. She paused. And from now on, if you see a problem, you bring it to leadership immediately. Understood? Understood. Dismissed. Brian walked out in a daze. He'd just ended Jonathan's career. Saved his own. Maybe saved the company. The victory felt hollow. Jonathan had been wrong, arrogant, negligent. But Brian had also stayed silent when speaking up might have prevented this entire disaster. They were both complicit in different ways. His phone buzzed. A text from Marcus. Conference room C, in 10 minutes. Bring your notebook. As he gathered his things, he saw Jonathan across the floor, packing belongings into a cardboard box. The same kind of box Jenny had carried out an hour ago. Jonathan looked up. Their eyes met. For a moment, Brian saw past the polished facade. He saw something raw and ugly. Anger, humiliation, wounded pride. Jonathan looked away first. Went back to packing. Brian walked to the conference room where Marcus was waiting. The next 72 hours were brutal. Marcus was everything Jonathan hadn't been: collaborative, willing to listen, genuinely interested in Brian's ideas. Together with 2 senior engineers, they tore apart the Horizon model and rebuilt it from the ground up. Device fingerprinting to catch duplicates, proper engagement scoring, segmentation between high-value and low-value users. All the things Brian had suggested months ago, finally implemented. Brian worked 18-hour days, slept at his desk, lived on coffee and vending machine food. Emma stayed with Mrs. Patterson. He called her every night to say goodnight, hating that he was missing bedtime stories. But the model came together, and it was good, better than the original, honest. On the 3rd day, Victoria called Brian into her office. The client agreed to a meeting. They'll review our new model tomorrow. If they're satisfied, they'll reinstate the contract with modified terms. If not, we're looking at potential litigation. Brian's stomach dropped. Tomorrow? Tomorrow. You'll present the technical findings. Marcus will present the remediation plan. I'll handle business negotiations. Me? Present to the client? Victoria's expression was unreadable. You identified the problems. You designed the solutions. You should be the one to explain them. Think you can handle it? Brian thought about the borrowed blazer and the interview where he'd been dismissed. About people who thought credentials mattered more than competence. Yes, he said. I can handle it. The client meeting was held in the main conference room. Richard Clemson, the silver-haired CEO who'd canceled their contract, sat at the head of the table with his technical team. They all looked skeptical, angry. Victoria made brief introductions. Then she turned to Brian. Mr. Miller will walk you through what went wrong and how we've fixed it. Brian stood, connected his laptop to the projector. His hands were steadier than he expected. 3 months ago, he began, this company told you your retention rate was 91%. That number was based on flawed methodology that was flagged multiple times during development. Those flags were ignored. This is why that was a mistake, and how we've corrected it. He walked them through everything: the duplicate account problem, the engagement metric issues, the lack of customer value segmentation. No excuses, no blame shifting, just clear technical explanation. Then he showed them the new model, the fixes, the validation testing, the projected accuracy improvements. Richard's technical team asked hard questions. Brian answered them honestly. When he didn't know something, he said so and explained how they'd find out. After 45 minutes, Richard held up his hand. Let me confer with my team. They stepped out. Brian sat down, shirt soaked with sweat. Marcus leaned over. You did great. Really great. 10 minutes later, Richard returned. Your new model addresses our concerns. The methodology is sound. We're satisfied with the technical remediation. He looked at Victoria. We'll reinstate the contract with one condition. Brian Miller is assigned as the lead technical consultant on our account. We want someone who actually listens to problems, not someone protecting their ego. Victoria didn't hesitate. Done. They shook hands. The meeting dissolved into discussions of timelines and deliverables. Brian sat there, trying to process that he'd just been promoted from junior engineer to lead consultant on a $20 million project. Later that evening, Marcus found Brian at his desk. Congratulations. You just saved the company. Jonathan's the one who almost destroyed it, Brian replied. Marcus nodded slowly. Jonathan's brilliant, but brilliance without humility is dangerous. He couldn't accept that someone he considered beneath him might see things he missed. That pride cost us everything. He paused. You know the difference between you two? You were willing to admit when you didn't know something. You asked questions. You listened. Those qualities matter more than any degree. Brian thought about that. About credentials and shattered careers. About borrowed blazers and second chances. What'll happen to him? He'll land somewhere. People with his background always do. But his reputation is damaged. It'll follow him. Marcus left. Brian checked his phone. A text from Emma. Mrs. Patterson said you got a big promotion. Can we get ice cream? Brian smiled. Typed back. 3 scoops. I'll pick you up in an hour. Before leaving, he walked past Jonathan's old desk. Someone else sat there now. All traces of 6 years already erased. Brian wondered if Jonathan had learned anything. If the humiliation had cracked through that armor of credentials and pride to something real underneath. Probably not. People like Jonathan rarely changed. They just found new places to be brilliant and new people to underestimate. But Brian had changed. He'd learned that silence in the face of wrong was its own kind of failure. That speaking truth to power was terrifying and necessary. That credentials opened doors, but character determined whether you belonged behind them. The next morning, Brian arrived at Harrison and Wells to find a note on his desk from Victoria. My office, 9 a.m. He knocked at exactly 9. Victoria gestured him in. Close the door. Brian sat. Victoria studied him. I owe you an apology, she said finally. I hired you because I saw potential, but I put you in an environment where that potential was being exploited. I should have noticed what Jonathan was doing. I should have created channels where junior engineers could raise concerns without fear. You gave me a chance when no one else would, Brian said. That's enough. It's not enough. It's the bare minimum. Victoria leaned back. I built this company on the principle that talent matters more than pedigree. But somewhere along the way, we started prioritizing credentials over contribution. People like Jonathan flourished because they had the right background, while people like you had to fight 3 times as hard for half the recognition. She paused. That's going to change. I'm implementing new policies. Anonymous technical review processes. Required rotation of junior engineers across project teams. Regular audits of who gets credit for innovations. It won't be perfect, but it'll be better. That sounds good. You helped me see what was broken. Thank you for that. Victoria's expression warmed slightly. Also, your salary is being adjusted to reflect your new role, $110,000 annually. Effective immediately. Brian's mind went blank. Thank you. You earned it. Now get out of my office. You have a $20 million project to manage. Brian stood, turned to leave, then stopped. Miss Hayes, why did you hire me back? After I was rejected the first time? Victoria was quiet for a moment. Because I read the notes from your interview. Jonathan wrote that you were technically adequate but lacking institutional rigor. Marcus wrote that you had unconventional thinking that could be valuable with proper mentoring. I trusted Marcus's instinct over Jonathan's credentials. She looked at Brian directly. Sometimes the people who fought the hardest to get in the room are the ones who see things others miss because they never took belonging for granted. Brian left her office with those words echoing in his head. He drove to Mrs. Patterson's apartment and picked up Emma. She ran to him with arms wide open. "Daddy!" "Mrs. Patterson said you're super important at work now." Brian scooped her up. "I'm just doing my job, sweetheart. Is it a good job? Do you like it?" He thought about the past 3 days, the exhaustion and stress and fear, the moment when he'd walked into that conference room knowing he might lose everything. "Yeah," he said. "I like it a lot." They got ice cream, 3 scoops each. Emma got chocolate, vanilla, and strawberry. Brian got coffee, which made Emma make a face. "That's a grown-up flavor," she declared. "I'm a grown-up. You're a super grown-up. With a super important job," Brian smiled. "Not that important, but it's enough." They sat on a bench watching the sunset paint the sky orange and pink. Emma's head rested against his shoulder. "Daddy?" "Yeah, sweetheart. I'm proud of you." Brian's throat went tight. "Thank you, Emma. That means everything." She fell asleep in the car on the way home. Brian carried her upstairs, tucked her into her bed, an actual bed now, not the couch. One of the first things he'd bought with his new salary. He stood in the doorway watching her sleep, thinking about how close he'd come to staying silent. How different everything would be if he'd chosen fear over truth. 6 months later, Project Horizon was running smoothly. The client was happy. Brian had delivered 3 more successful projects. Emma had her own bedroom and enough ice cream to last a lifetime. Brian had learned something important. The system wasn't broken because it let people like Jonathan in. It was broken because it made people like Jonathan believe their credentials made them infallible. The real victory wasn't proving Jonathan wrong. It was proving that competence comes in many forms, from many paths, and that the most dangerous people in any organization are those too proud to learn from someone they consider beneath them. Not every day was easy. Some colleagues still questioned his background. But Brian had learned that proving yourself was a daily practice, not a one-time achievement. He heard through office gossip that Jonathan landed at a startup, probably still brilliant, probably still dismissive of anyone without the right pedigree. But that was Jonathan's story to live with. Brian had his own story now, and it was just beginning.